Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. It's good to have you again here in Odyssey Charter High School World History. And we're going to be talking this week about China and Japan and Korea. And we're going to start off by looking at China at the height of its power back during when Europe was first coming out of the Middle Ages and the Dark Ages. China was one of the most powerful nations on the earth. And so we're going to look and see a little bit about this massive country that today is kind of re-exerting itself in our modern world. So a little quick review. What did we do last time? Well, essentially what we did was we looked at the Ottoman Empire. We talked a little bit about religion and art within the Ottoman Empire. We talked about the Safavids, the dynasty that's focused on today's modern Iran. And then finally we ended up with the Mughal dynasty in what is today India and Pakistan. So we're continuing our move to the east and looking at China and Japan this time. In terms of the reading, I'm going to have you guys read pages 485 to 494 out of chapter 16 for this part for lesson 5a, and of course that'll go right along with assignment 5a. In terms of our preview, what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about two major dynasties in China during the 1400 to 1800 time frame. The first is the Ming dynasty. The second is the Qing, even though it looks like Qing or King dynasty, it's actually the Qing dynasty. We'll talk a little bit about daily life in China and then Chinese culture. Some key terms that I need you to know is Q, banner, xenophobic, capitalism, and clan. We'll take a look at those as it relates to this particular chapter. So let's get right into it. The first dynasty we're going to take a look at is the Ming dynasty. And if anybody has watched Mulan, you know that in China a long, long time ago, the Mongols, people coming out of what is today Mongolia, under Genghis Khan and his relatives, were the major dynasty in China prior to about 1368. And they were finally kicked out. Their dynasty ended in about that point. And the Chinese individuals started to build their own dynasty called the Ming dynasty. Ming dynasty was centered on Beijing, and all of kind of eastern China became part of the Ming dynasty over time. The Ming dynasty's emperors consolidated power. That means they pulled together the power throughout the empire. They strengthened the Great Wall. So the Great Wall of China that was initially designed to keep the Mongols out was strengthened. And they made peace with their neighbors. So it was really an opportunity for them to have some internal systems going, and they didn't have to worry about war on the outside. They also were big-time explorers, and Zheng He made some voyages to the west. And actually there's a new book out suggesting that the Chinese, and not Columbus, may have been the first non-Native Americans to land in what is currently North America. The Ming Dynasty was incredibly popular and powerful for a long time, but ultimately, as most things do, it failed. Essentially what happens is the leaders became weaker and weaker. When you have a poor leader, especially when leadership is based all at the top by a king or an emperor, and you have ineffectual and inefficient leaders, that can bring down the dynasty, and that's exactly what happened. We also saw high taxes and corruption of government were a large problem. Certainly these are issues that go on today. If you read the newspaper, these are concerns that people have even in our modern day, and they were within the Ming dynasty as well. There were a number of different peasant revolts, so individual farmers got together and were unhappy with what was going on. That was in about the 1600s. And finally, the Manchurians, or the Manchus, moved from the northeast part of the country and created their own new dynasty. That new dynasty was called the Qing dynasty. The emperors of the Qing dynasty adopted Chinese systems. So they didn't, even though they moved in from outside of the dynasty or outside of the empire, they pretty much kept the same basic ideas, and so they were accepted. The nobility, the Manchu nobility, were seen as distinctive. They felt that they were above the average Chinese individual, and that set them apart. Kangxi was the strongest leader of the Qing dynasty, and it tied the large empire together. So this was another powerful, powerful ruling dynasty, and one that was focused again on the power of the emperor. In terms of what was going on with Westerners in China, well, Marco Polo was one of the early Westerners to move from Italy into China to see the riches of China and to start to trade. And missionaries also came at this time to try to spread the word of Christianity. There was a significant Western influence, especially as the Qing dynasty began to weaken. Western influence became more powerful, and China's trading back and forth became more and more important to Europe. In the 1790s, however, Emperor Qinglong tries to limit foreign contact. He's very concerned of what's going on with his people and the culture, and decides to start to close the doors of China to Western trade. Some of the economic changes that occur in China during this time was that China experienced huge population growth between about 1300 and 1700. Of course, now we know that China is the largest nation on earth with about 1.2 billion people, but this huge population growth is really goes all the way back into the 13, 14, 1500s. Because of all this population increase, we had land shortages. There wasn't enough land for everybody, and that led to some real problems and some focus on the cities. There's a huge trade with the West, as I mentioned, and we are shifting from farming towards manufacturing. So as people pull into the cities, we focus on manufacturing as opposed to farming. What was going on with women in China? Well, women, unfortunately, and the young ladies in the class are not going to be happy about this, women were generally considered to be inferior to men in China during this time frame. Women were focused and expected to organize the home and family life. That was their role, essentially, in the home during this time frame. Women legally could not divorce or inherit property, so they were subservient in the legal system to men. And women's feet were often bound to limit their mobility. And so the foot binding that you may have heard of, where when a woman was a small child, a girl, the feet would be bound so it almost hobbled them. They had a very limited ability to move on their own, and hence they could not run away. So not a really good time if you are a feminist or somebody who believes in the idea that women or men are equal. Certainly that was not the role of women in China during this time frame. China, however, even though it had some social issues that it was dealing with, like we just talked about, the artistic issues of China were world famous. I mean, certainly art and architecture was at its height during this time frame. The Imperial City in Beijing, the Forbidden City, is a classic example. I've been there, have taught in China, and matter of fact, I'm going to be going back this summer, and so I can attest to the fact that these are just beautiful, beautiful artistic buildings. Only the nobles could enter the Forbidden City, and if anybody had tried to go in, they would have been killed to see the emperor. There was supposed to be over 9,000 rooms in the Forbidden City. Also, China was world famous for its porcelain. That was something that the West traded with a lot. That's why we call very nice, fancy dishes China, is because that's where originally it came from. So that's a little bit about China during its height. We'll be looking more at that during our reading, and then we'll move on to to Japan and Korea for the second half of this lesson. Thanks a lot.